Well, good afternoon, everybody, and we should say a very big welcome to Vice President Gore, a man who has been an inspiration for many of us over the years. We are absolutely delighted that you have come today to join us in King's. I think, as everyone knows, the main reason he's here is for the university sermon tomorrow. I hope you all come along to that. You're all warmly welcome, whether or not you have tickets. If you don't have tickets, you may have to queue up and get there early, but do come along. But we're going to have a chance to hear from him tomorrow about his thoughts and his message. Right now, though, we have a chance for a fireside chat and a chance to ask questions about what he really thinks. We are, though, of course, on the record as well, just to let you know that. Earlier on, he met with some climate activist students, and they had a fantastic dialogue about how to keep the faith and keep fighting. And so what I'm going to do now is just ask you a few questions for about 20 minutes, and then open it up to as many of you as possible to ask questions as well. He's somebody who, as you all know, ran to become president in 2000 and lost. He did an extremely noble thing by actually deciding to not contest the ballots and have a recount. If only more people would follow your example. I think many of us often wonder what would have happened if you had indeed challenged it and gone on to win. I think the world would be very different today. But having lost, you then poured your energies into fighting the climate fight and having a very profound impact on the current generation. So I'd like to start by asking you, and I should say in America, I think you all know that it's customary to retain titles. So if we were sitting in America, I'd address you as Mr. Vice President. Since we're sitting in King's and we pride ourselves on being inclusive and informal, I hope you don't mind if I call you by your first name, if that is acceptable.
It's fine.
But,
Paul Simon gives you permission.
But I'd like to start by asking you, when you look at what has happened in the years since 2000, do you feel more or less optimistic about the outlook for the fight against climate change?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here for these days. I've been looking forward to it, and just to make it clear, I have tremendous respect for this university and for King's College, but I will let you in on a secret. The real reason I'm here is for Gillian and Tett. And as for referring to me as Mr. Vice President, I was sharing with some of the student climate leaders earlier that I had my children and grandchildren together in a meeting a week ago or so, and one of my 5-year-old twin grandchildren was being explained, her mother was explaining to her that some of the people would call your granddad Mr. Vice President. Why, she asked, and went through the explanation, and we were still called by that title afterwards, and she looked up and she said, creepy.
Well, in that case, I'm definitely going to call you Mr. Vice President.
So I am optimistic. I'm temperamentally optimistic by nature, so I retain my optimism, and it's hard to keep the struggle going well if you're not optimistic, and I think there's ample reason for optimism. When you frame the question as a comparative exercise, 24 years ago and now, that makes it a little more challenging. But just to set the stage for my answer, today we, humanity, will put another 162 million tons of human-caused global warming pollution into the troposphere at the lower level of the atmosphere, which we are using as an open sewer. It is trapping enough extra heat energy in the Earth system today to equal the amount of heat that would be released by 750,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding today on the Earth. And that's every day. And the pollution mainly CO2, but also methane, nitrous oxides, and so forth. The main one is CO2. It drives most of the rest. Each atom, each molecule rather, lingers there on average about 100 years. Some less, some more. The math is above my pay grade, but I've had it explained to me. And the scientists say 100-year average is okay to use. So it builds up over time. And that's what's putting all of the extra heat in the oceans and the atmosphere, melting the ice and driving the climate refugees from areas that are becoming physiologically unlivable and raising the sea level and making the storms stronger and causing the rain bombs and the mudslides and the droughts simultaneously. And so we have not slowed that down yet. However, we are gaining momentum, and the solutions that we have begun to put in place are manifestly better for us in every way. The replacement of the climate crisis is a fossil fuel crisis. It's a fossil fuel crisis. We've known that for a long time. 80% plus of all the causes come from the burning of fossil fuels. Last year, just to shift to the optimism side of things, if I asked you, and some of the students here I know the answer to this, but if I asked you to look at the number one market for fossil fuels and generation of electricity, what percentage of the new electricity generation installed worldwide last year was renewable? Many of you would be surprised to hear that the answer is 87%. Quite remarkable. How many of the 2- and 3-wheeled motorized vehicles sold last year were electric? 50%. 20% of all the cars, 25% here in the UK, on the way up. Electric heat pumps in many European countries, 50% installation last year. It's real, or an increase, 50%. That is taking off as well. Regenerative agriculture, sustainable forestry, circular manufacturing loops, they will take a little more time, but they are also in process. So we are gaining momentum. If we continue and if we accelerate these gains, we will soon be gaining on the crisis itself. One of the markers for success on an interim basis is the achievement of what's called net zero, where the incremental amount in the atmosphere is not being added to every year. Once we reach net zero, then something astonishing happens. The temperatures on Earth will stop going up almost immediately. They used to think that the temperature increases would continue because of positive feedback loops that are initiated and triggered. No, there is now a well understood consensus that it'll stop with a lag of as little as 3 to 5 years. More astonishing still, if we stay at true net zero, half of all the human-generated greenhouse gas pollution will fall out of the atmosphere in as little as 25 to 30 years. That's really remarkable. And if we achieve the same with methane, and methane begins to come down sharply. It's a short-lived gas, as you know, compared to the 100-year average for CO2, which is 12 years for methane, even though it has more than 80 times the heat trapping potential per molecule. Then we could actually see a beginning of cooling back on the Earth. Now, those are big ifs because we have to achieve those goals. But what a marvelous source of optimism that we can stop the temperatures going up almost immediately if we can just get our act together on replacing these fossil fuel technologies. And that we can start the healing process in as little as a quarter century. It's really quite hopeful. And we have tailwinds in our favor. Solar electricity and wind electricity have become the cheapest, well, solar is the cheapest source of electricity in human history. The International Energy Agency says it's the queen of energy markets now, and it continues to get cheaper. It's at 1.1 cents per kilowatt. I mean, it's amazing how cheap it's come. And the cost down is not just in the solar cells, it's in the casing, the installation models, the accounting structures, etc. It's continuing downward. So it's better for us to do it. And by the way, when you replace fossil fuels as the source of electricity generation, you also cut the co-pollution of soot or particulate matter, or 2.5 ppm as it's often called these days, which kills an estimated 8.7 million people every year in the world from lung diseases. So that's good. And if you get rid of the mercury poisoning that comes with it and all of the other the nitrous oxides, etc., it improves human health quite dramatically. There are other reasons why it's better for us in every single way. So I'm optimistic. The crisis is still getting worse faster than we are deploying these solutions. So that would lead you to a pessimistic posture. But we're gaining momentum, and soon we'll be deploying faster, and the crisis is getting worse.
So, I mean, that's very encouraging to hear, because there are a lot of people in the room, a lot of people at King's and across Cambridge who are involved in various forms of research around solar panels, around developing green aviation fuel, all kinds of different technologies and techniques to try and combat that. So it's very exciting to hear that you think this could potentially slow or even reverse the warming eventually, but it won't without political will. What do you make of the current political backlash?
What research do you have going on into the formation of political will?
Well, we don't have any scientists looking at the formation of political will.
Well, it's a serious question,
yeah,
and I'm not sure any university would have a good answer to that question, but it's often seemed important to me to broaden the spectrum of research that's underway. And in so many universities, it's only on the technology, and in too many universities, it's only on the technologies that the fossil fuel industry prefers.
Well, I was going to come to that in a moment. We are actually about to launch one particular research project to look at that issue of politics and society, which I'll talk about later on. But before we do that, though, I mean, do you think that the backlash we're seeing in the UK, in the US, that's likely to intensify if Donald Trump wins the next election, is going to completely derail all of this?
Well, the backlash, I was stunned by your hypothetical. Sorry, it was a reflex. The relationship between fear and reason is one that has been written about quite extensively in the era of the founding of the United States. Thomas Paine wrote about this. Others have written about it extensively. And fear drives out reason. There's an asymmetrical set of linkages between the amygdala, which you could, they tell me, describe as the principal fear center in the brain, and the neocortex. And the pathway from the amygdala to the neocortex is a superhighway, and it works instantly. We have a life-threatening signal here. The neocortex is immediately triggered. The pathway in the opposite direction from the neocortex to the amygdala to modify our understanding of what's a fear that we should react to, that's a very thin little pathway. And so there's an asymmetry involved. And demagogues have often found it useful to activate fear and grievance to overwhelm the role of reason and negate the rule of reason. Anyone who, look at Viktor Orban in Hungary, for example, so I can deflect away from my own country's politics. Wherever you see this happening, of course, a demagogue with political power has the opportunity to use fear, and they often do. I'm optimistic about the outcome of this pending election in my country, but political forecasting is not my forte, so I'm not going to bother you with my opinions on it.
Right. One of the things that's happened in the last couple of years is the fossil fuel industry has moved from simply ignoring the issue of climate change to trying to get involved in some areas of seeking to mitigate it.
Oh, really? I hadn't noticed that. What, was that? What are you referring to?
Well, COP28, COP29.
You saw that as an exercise in fossil fuel companies trying to mitigate it?
Well, they were certainly trying to get engaged in the debate. And
Oh,
would you
right.
regard that as would you take them, would you trust them at all? Do you think that they should be kept out of the conversation today, or would you like to bring them into the tent?
I gave a speech or a TED talk for TED Countdown last July in which I laid out a set of 8 or 10 criteria that should be used to answer the specific question, should fossil fuel company A, B, or C be allowed to participate in the COPs? If they have a true net zero plan, if they are using their windfall profits to invest in the energy transition, if they're fully transparent, et cetera, then yes, we can benefit from their knowledge and expertise. If their purpose in being there is simply to halt progress, which is mostly what they've done, and if they are not transparent, if they are making serial dishonest statements about what they're doing, then no, they should not be allowed to participate. You know, the history of the principal obstacle to humanity's effort to solve the climate crisis, which is far, far, far more dangerous than is commonly understood worldwide. The principal obstacle to the solution is the fossil fuel industry. No question about it. And it's been amply demonstrated, proven. Journalism prizes have been won for going back through the history of this. And the history is that in the 1960s and 1970s and early 1980s, many of these companies had very well-respected, very capable scientists on their staffs who did, in many cases, world-class work in showing the CEO and the boards of these companies exactly what was going to happen. They nailed it. They nailed it. And then in the mid to late 80s, these companies made a decision to hide the research that their own scientists had reported to them. And they made a decision, shockingly, really, I mean, why more people are not shocked by this, I don't understand fully. They made a calculated decision to organize and lavishly finance a program of lies directed at the public and policymakers to make people, to deceive people into thinking the climate crisis was still a very uncertain prospect, and that we didn't understand it well enough to justify taking action in the near term. They lied. Fossil fuel industries speak with forked tongue, as we would put it in the US, or some people would. And then they began to offer a whole series of false solutions that were designed to fit into that larger strategy of deceiving the public. There was a very well-received book called The Merchants of Doubt, written by a historian of science at Harvard, Naomi Oreskes. She was at the University of California, San Diego when she wrote this. Mark Conway, her co-author, also was on the book. They demonstrated very persuasively, with the evidence is all there, that the fossil fuel industry used a playbook that had been prepared in the 1950s by the large tobacco companies. some of this history is known. You can go on Google today and find old television advertisements from the tobacco companies in which they reacted to a very famous scientific study put forward by the Surgeon General in the United States and the counterparts in other countries around the world. The research showed up lung cancer, other diseases of the lung and heart, deadly to smoke cigarettes. They hired actors, the companies hired actors, and dressed them up as doctors in white coats with stethoscopes, and they put them in front of cameras like this one on teleprompters to say, "Hello, I'm Dr. So-and-so, and I'm here to tell you there are no health problems associated with smoking cigarettes whatsoever. In fact, the brand I like is," and this, the Surgeon General's report was on the news for one day and follow-up stories for a few days. These ads ran massively, and newspaper, radio, everything. And 100 million people died unnecessarily during the long period of delay in translating the scientific findings into public policy. The fossil fuel industry consciously took that blueprint, hired some of the very same public relations firms, some of the same, I probably shouldn't use the phrase scientific prostitutes, some scientists from, so I won't, scientists from disciplines far afield from climate who came out to to sell their expertise in a phony way. So they have consciously tried to do this, and with some success. And simultaneously, they geared up a massive increase in their participation in campaign contributions and lobbying, and they made it very clear to congressmen and senators and all around the country, if you're with us, you'll get our money. If you're not, we'll finance your opponent. And they have tried, they're much better at capturing politicians than they are at capturing emissions. And they have perfected the art of taking over the policymaking process. They're not the only ones. I'll give you a quick example to illustrate the broader point. 92% of all Americans, both political parties, want a ban on assault rifles and stricter gun control measures. The chances of that passing in the Congress is 0. Because the gun manufacturers have used cultural tribalism, the same techniques, blah, blah, blah. And you can go down the list of a number of public policy choices that are not made these days according to the rule of reason in the forms and traditions of representative democracy. Instead, they are virtually dictated by special interest groups that use this combination of false propaganda, lobbying, campaign contributions, etc. So should they participate? If they're among the few that actually cross those thresholds, yes. Otherwise, no.
What do you think universities should do with fossil fuel companies?
Well, let me say, because one of the student leaders, I was so impressed with your student leaders here, one of them asked me if I would do a video endorsing the fossil fuel research, and I said, I will look into this camera and say, I fully endorse the fossil fuel research movement. I think it's really...
Research into the fossil fuel industry.
Fossil fuel research, yeah, into energy and climate, and how to form a political consensus, and how to do the other research agenda projects that I wish my own alma mater would do, etc.
That is the University of Texas, isn't it? So.
No, I went in the other Cambridge.
Oh, right,
the younger.
The younger Cambridge.
Yeah.
Yes.
I used this analogy in a small group earlier, and don't misunderstand me when I refer to Adolf Hitler's book, The Triumph of the Will. We know that it's not fair or judicious to use Hitler as an analog for any comparison or the Holocaust, etc. But I think it's fair to ask the question, what was the will supposed to triumph over? In what contest are we describing where the will triumphs? I think that he intended the will to triumph over the authority of knowledge. The authority of knowledge. We have learned, humanity has learned, to use open discourse among people who have different points of view in a search for the best available evidence, and then through that discourse arrive at a consensus on what's more likely than not to be true, and then base decisions on our collective future on that knowledge that the majority has agreed is probably the best truth we can grasp. That's why authoritarians want to ban books. That's why they want to cancel climate research in government venues, in the US, for example. And when nations or kingdoms are trying to solve a problem as complex as the climate crisis, they will naturally draw upon the authority of knowledge, which usually means consulting with the most learned experts, often in universities, who have devoted their lives to drilling down in a specific area of knowledge so that they can impart to the rest of us what they've found. So if the fossil fuel companies want to subvert the authority of knowledge, how better to do it than to gain influence in universities and buy the research agenda for the university, and to give money to universities in return for the university's agreement to let them participate in the teaching. Let's let the fossil fuel companies teach along with the professors. Let them tell the young students what they think they should learn about the climate crisis. One university in the US has a teaching block on the COPs, the conferences of the parties. And they chose a fossil fuel company vice president to teach that block of the course. There's so many other examples. Why do so many universities, surveying all of the challenges that are presented by the climate crisis, why do so many of them say, you know what our #1 priority ought to be? Carbon capture and sequestration. Let's figure out how we can let the fossil fuel companies continue to put all the junk up there that they want to, and then bring it back just as quickly as we can. That seems like such a great idea because the fossil fuel companies are in favor of it. And we have some really clever scientists and engineers and scholars who can really work on that carbon capture and sequestration challenge. Really? I mean, you know, CO2 is 0.035% of the atmosphere. So they're going to go through 99.965% of all the other molecules in order to pick out the 0.035. Why? Again, because the fossil fuel companies will permit that and they'll provide funding for it. Okay? But research on how to speed up the replacement of fossil fuels in electricity generation, transportation, heavy industry, etc. No. We don't want to spend any money there. Let's take the university research capacity and just focus it on.
Right. One other quick question, and I'm going to turn to questions from the audience. I think you will know that you can send them, I think, via the QR code. Is that right? Yes, up there. And we've already got a number of questions streaming in. The question I wanted to ask quickly, though, is you believe very strongly that it's not just about more scientific inquiry and the type of Socratic debate that we champion at universities like Cambridge. It's also about transparency, and that's going to be critical about actually getting political will. And you've actually launched a very interesting project recently, which is trying to use scientific innovation to increase transparency and essentially get more young people and more entrepreneurs involved in this. Do you want to say something about this, about your Climate Trace project?
Thank you very much. Climate Trace. Trace stands for Tracking Real-Time Atmospheric Carbon Emissions. And regardless of what you hear me saying in the next minute or two on this, you can go on your computer browser to climatetrace.org and see for yourselves. It's free, open to the public. Lord Kelvin, long ago, was the first to say what's now a business meme: you can only manage what you can measure. And in our efforts to solve the climate crisis, we've never had a precise measurement of where the pollution's coming from. We know the general categories, we can see some of the big emitters, but Climate Trace uses artificial intelligence. We have a coalition of AI specialists, data scientists, climate scientists. It's all nonprofit, and we use AI to actually identify and measure every significant source of greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. You will find, if you go to it on your computer, the largest 352 million point source emission sites all around the world. You will see all the ones close to Cambridge here. Every country, every region, the entire...
You can literally pinpoint which areas, which companies...
How much last year, how much this year. We'll go to quarterly this year, then we'll go to monthly. Eventually we'll get it down to every 6 minutes. You have to use AI. We get data from 300 existing satellites every hour. We have land, sea, and air-based observation as well. And we're able to get in friendly geographies where CEOs are on site and will give us their own monitoring. We use that for ground source truthing. It doesn't work as well on the phone as it does on the laptop. climatetrace.org, but thank you for looking. You have to use AI because methane, you can see it directly from space. CO2, you cannot really, because the atmosphere is so enriched with CO2. Here it is May, it's 424 parts per million. This is the highest point each year. So you're looking down through a column of air that has so much CO2 at a target that's surrounded by highways or other emitters of CO2. So the signal to noise ratio defies your effort to really pinpoint where it's coming from. With AI, you can measure. You can combine infrared with visual on the smokestacks, with off-take data, the ripples of water in the cooling pond. I pulled out in my briefing, I hadn't seen this in quite a while, but my staff put it together. 25 years ago, when I was vice president, I went to the Museum of Science in Los Angeles and launched something called the Digital Earth program, which included a bunch of things. Google Earth came out of that. But also I proposed further technological progress is needed to realize the full potential of the digital Earth in areas such as automatic interpretation of imagery, the fusion of data from multiple sources, and intelligent agents that can find and link information about every specific spot on the planet. But enough of the pieces are in place now to warrant proceeding with this new initiative. That developed into the precursor of Climate Trace. And AI, when it became available, makes it possible. So we now know exactly where it's coming from, and we're identifying places identical to specific emission sites elsewhere in the world that have been successfully converted.
And that essentially allows activists to track the companies and measure what's actually happening compared to what they claim is happening.
Correct. And governments. And also, large corporates are using it right now. General Motors, Polestar, Tesla, Boeing, the whole list. They're using it right now to swap out suppliers in their supply chain, lower emission sites for higher emission sites.
Yeah, one of those who believes that if you want to find reasons to be optimistic in the face of so much reason to be pessimistic, transparency is one of the reasons. And of course, you're also appealing to entrepreneurs everywhere to use the data and create new products with it, because you've made that data free.
Yes, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free.
Yeah, so if anyone here wants to set up a company using this data to try and campaign, it's out there, you can use it. We have a lot of questions, so I'm going to go straight to questions now, and do keep sending them in if you want to ask more questions. But one of the first questions is actually in relation to your comments about technology and the amazing, absolutely amazing potential for science and technology to start tackling some of these issues. Someone has thrown a bit of cold water over it and said, do you think that any fundamental cultural changes, such as decreased consumption, are needed to achieve climate repair? Can we only rely on tech to solve this problem?
Well, the short answer is no. We do need to deal with the issues related to endless growth on a finite planet. We need to marry changes in the incentive structures we have in our economies with new technology to try to leverage that. You know, relying only on the supply side, that is ever more abundant, ever cheaper sources of renewable energy, has gotten us a good ways down the road, but we have to deal with the demand side. And we've known for a long time that a fee or a tax on carbon has been needed. I first proposed one back when I was in the United States Senate a long time ago, a revenue-neutral tax on carbon. We actually got it in January of 1993 when Bill Clinton and I moved into the White House. I had won an internal struggle during the transition period to get a carbon tax in our first budget. Jim Backus remembers this.
I do. I voted for it.
Yeah, thank you very much. You may have lost your seat because of it as well. But it passed the House of Representatives, and then it went to the Senate, where so many good ideas go to die. And it was defeated. And the political pain served as a source of PTSD for Congresses later on. But we have to, now the so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism, a device that's emerged in Europe and is appealing to other places. I think that may serve as a pathway to finally get a carbon tax that the U.S. can accept. I don't want to be overly optimistic, but we have to work on the demand side.
Right. Got a question here. Do you think the rise in pressing global security concerns, better known as war, that's my words, not the questioner's, has the potential to squander progress in awareness of the need for climate action? In other words, is the fight being derailed by the fact that there is growing concern about war and growing concern about, human rights issues?
Yeah. Well, one of the challenges for those of us who've worked on the climate crisis for decades has been there's always something else that's going to take over the spotlight, for sure, but that's true of many issues. I think that there is a growing recognition that the dependence on fossil fuels is often a cause of war and a cause of conflict. Look at the invasion of Iraq in 2003. There are many examples. But I think that we have to keep moving forward in spite of the other challenges that command our attention.
Right. I've got another question here, which is, do you think it's possible for climate action and capitalism to coexist?
Yes, I do, but let me say that there is more than one form of capitalism. And I do think that we need major reforms in the nature of the capitalism that we pursue. We have had an unhealthy focus on the short-term benefits of one category of stakeholders in capitalism: equity owners in the short term. And that excludes a lot of values that should be taken into account. In 1937, a famous economist named Simon Kuznets was one of those who was trying to give policymakers better tools to avoid another Great Depression. So recently survived. Well, we're still in a Great Depression, 37. And he came up with the national accounts, of which GDP is the best known example. Most corporate accounting structures are derivative of the national accounts. And Kuznets was a brilliant man, and when he was awarded these prizes, he gave a number of speeches when he said, please do not use this as a basis for national economic policy. And 7 years later at Bretton Woods, it was codified, and now it's like the QWERTY keyboard on the typewriter. You can't get rid of it. What was wrong? Why did he say don't use it? He said it excludes at least 4 very important categories of value. Number 1 is the best known, negative externalities. That's almost a buzz phrase these days. Pollution is a negative externality. It's not included, not counted. So capitalism needs to internalize those externalities. Second category is not as well known, but equally valuable. Positive externalities. What does that refer to? Investments in public goods. Like if a community invests in mental health care, then that's an expense. Write it down, take that out of your budget. In the years that follow, the benefits that come rolling back into the community, if it's done well, that's not counted as income. So it's it's like the old Roach Motel, one way. Third, depreciation of natural resources. And think first of all about topsoil and groundwater, underground aquifers. When those are depleted, out of sight, out of mind, not included in the categories. And number 4, the distribution of incomes and net worths. And that's not a communist idea for redistribution. It's just a recognition that tax structures and accounting structures and policies result in the distribution of incomes and net worths. So that's what we still live with in what we call capitalism. And so when GDP ticks up 3.5%, that's a cause for celebration. Until you look and notice that it's accompanied by a vast increase in the pollution of the environment, most of all this thin shell surrounding the planet, that it's accompanied by a continuation of the chronic underinvestment in education and healthcare, pandemic preparedness, and all of the other environmental protection, where it's accompanied by the rapid and reckless depreciation of groundwater and topsoil, and even more importantly than any of this, the web of living species of which we're a part. We're in the 6th great extinction, as you know. And then third, the transition from inequality to hyper-inequality, where a growing share of the income goes to the top 1% and the top 1/10 of 1%. And that's why a lot of the people who are in the bottom 90% vote for Donald Trump and others, demagogues who try to divert attention away from what is happening. And so when you say, but capitalism writ large is like gravity, in my opinion. People are going to exchange things that they have an easier time doing with others who are better at something else. Been there forever, will always be. And all of that I mentioned earlier, 87% of the new electricity generation was from how was that financed? 85% of it was financed by the private market. Okay? The capitalism gives the dynamism and supplies of capital necessary to make this transition to a sustainable society. Now, another defect, and I'll stop on this, is that the current system for the allocation of capital globally shuts off most of the developing countries. If you want to build a huge solar field in Nigeria, the interest rates you'll pay are as much as 7 times higher than you would pay in the rich country. We have to change that. So, and there are other problems with capitalism as we currently find it, but capitalism per se, I'm all for it.
Well, that leads very nicely to a question from a student saying, how fair is it to ask developing nations to leapfrog to renewable energy as the global north is mainly responsible for the climate crisis?
Well, it's not as if you're asking them to do something that is not in their own interest. If the United States or the United Kingdom was suddenly faced with a situation magically where we had no electricity and we had to decide how we were going to generate electricity, we wouldn't go out and burn coal and put wooden poles with copper wires everywhere. We would leapfrog to the cheaper, easier, cleaner, better technology that we now have available. These telephones, would we put all the landline wires everywhere and the rotary dials? No, because we would leapfrog to the newer, better technology. It makes all the sense in the world. So the idea that the rich countries have used up the carbon space, as you will sometimes hear, it is a false argument. The space is I mentioned the troposphere earlier. You know, you've seen these images of the thin blue line on the horizon from the astronauts. It's a thin blue shell. It's blue because that's where the oxygen is. If you could drive a car straight up in the air to the top of that blue line, you'd get to the top of that blue line at highway speeds in about 5 to 7 minutes. That's how thin it is. You could walk it in an hour. And below you is all the global warming pollution. That's what we're using as an open sewer. And the idea that developing countries have some kind of right to add to that burden when there is a much better alternative. Of course they have a right. We can't tell them not to do it. But when we ask them and offer assistance in the appropriate ways to speed up the deployment of these newer technologies, that's not a burden for them. It's an opportunity for them.
Right. Okay, we've got one more question about AI, and then a big collection of questions have come in around the issue of protest. So first, you talked about the positive aspects of AI. How concerned are you about the negative aspects in terms of the energy consumption?
Yeah, well, you know, the NVIDIA has 99% of the chip market in AI for generative AI, and their flagship H100 chipset uses as much energy as the average American home, which is a lot. They sold enough H100s last year to cumulatively equal the energy consumption of the city of San Francisco. So adding another San Francisco each year, and the other companies are coming along, that's going to be a big tax on energy. Now, the consumer-facing technology companies are helping to lead the way for solar and wind and battery deployment, so there's that. But I think that we're going to have to come to grips with this, and crypto also. I'm not a big fan of crypto, but that's a big energy consumer also. In that case, it's, in my opinion, unnecessary. But AI is also giving us remarkably powerful tools to help solve the climate crisis. Climate Trace is one example, measuring where it all comes from, but there are many other examples. We're already seeing the application of generative AI in fusion research with very promising results. By the way, I had my first congressional hearing on fusion energy 45 years ago, and the expert said it's 50 years out, so I'm getting excited. On generative AI, I don't know if you want me to share what we were
Yeah, briefly, about. And then we got a couple of other, yeah.
I was telling Gillian earlier about my fascination with the scientist who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1977, Ilya Prigogine. And bear with me, and I'll explain why I believe his discovery is so important in generative AI. He studied open systems and systems that are not closed but have energy or information flowing in, through, and out again. And he discovered that when a certain threshold on the throughput is crossed, two things happen sequentially. The first is unremarkable. The pattern inside the system breaks down. You can't accommodate the extra flow. But then the second thing that happens is the mind-blowing thing. The system then spontaneously reorganizes itself at a higher level of complexity. That's astonishing. It's currently classified as a major corollary to the second law of thermodynamics, the entropy law. I think, who am I to say, but I think it should be its own new law of thermodynamics, because it is the opposite of entropy. It is an act of creation that is in the woof and warp of the universe itself. Wow, there are a lot of implications for that. How does it apply to generative AI? To generative AI? Well, when ChatGPT, whatever it was, 3, I guess, triggered the explosion of analysis. A lot of the leading researchers, and you have a lot of them here in Cambridge, but Stephen Wolfram in the US, for example, was one of those who said, this is doing things we didn't expect and we still cannot explain. Capacity, one of them taught itself to learn Sanskrit. It taught itself to learn Fortran. Whoa. Claude 3, the new chatbot of Anthropic, they're feeding, it's ingesting all this data, so they drop a line that's completely different from the text that was being fed. And the chatbot immediately spoke up and said, there's a sentence in here that's completely different from the rest of this material. Did you make a mistake, or are you planning to test me on this later? And they were, in fact, planning the needle in a haystack test. So the question is, are these software programs capable of consciousness? And most people would reflexively say, no way, can't be done. In my opinion, if you look at one of the narratives in the history of science, there's a long succession of blows to the collective ego of humanity. Copernicus and Galileo, Darwin, Freud, you can go on with the examples. We're not in a universe now, and we're certainly in a multiverse. Really? Well, when the first DeepMind model was developed, before Google bought DeepMind, and I was friends with the guys who founded DeepMind, they ran at 2 petaflops, 2 trillion floating operations per second. Their latest model runs at 10 billion petaflops. From 2 to 10 billion in 9 years. That's 40 times faster than Moore's Law. I think that in the nature of Prigoghine's discovery, inside that large language model, there was a spontaneous reorganization at a higher level of complexity. And boom, here we are. Are they conscious yet? Well, you know, one of the employees at Google who worked for my friend Mustafa Suleiman said, it's conscious, it's alive, I'm having a dialogue with it. And he went out the next day to hire lawyers to protect the rights of this model. That's when he was fired. And most people said, come on, crazy. 4 months later, 2 researchers at Microsoft published a peer-reviewed paper saying aspects of human-level consciousness are being manifested in this new model. They weren't fired, they were published. And it's shocking to our systems, but I think that's where this is probably going.
Right. Well, since we're sitting in the former home of Alan Turing, that is very thought-provoking indeed. We are almost out of time, but we also have a question here, which is, how effective do you think campus protests, legal or illegal, are for students to achieve their goals, such as divestment? Of course, just the other side of the wall is one big encampment and campus protest. I'm curious whether you think that is the right way to essentially try to campaign, and whether you're concerned that it's going to derail from the issue of climate change or not. And if you were 18 years old today, would you be out there as well?
Well, I'm going to try my best to avoid getting too deeply entangled in the issues surrounding Gaza and what Israel is doing in response to these Hitler-level atrocities of October 7th. They need to free the hostages as the first step. It's impossible for any of us to imagine how we would react if family members or community members had suffered the kind of atrocities that triggered this whole thing. But as it has proceeded over these months, the young people who are viewing it are experiencing in their generation what you might call a moral moment. There are times throughout history where the younger generation has a view of current events that is different in kind from what older generations are seeing and interpreting. When I was their age, I was a protester against the Vietnam War in the U.S. And those who are older, not all by any means, but many were obsessed with the domino theory and the advance of communism and so forth. But the war in Vietnam was the first war that was televised. And my generation back then was receiving information that a lot of other people were not in the same way. This is the first war on TikTok and on social media generally, and the information stream is very, very different. And now, the efficacy of encampments or protests, or I think that's what you're asking about. I think there are times when young people feel an inability to convey their point of view about something they feel so strongly about that they're going to go to the edge and a bit over. And it's not my place to criticize specific tactics. I think there is a difference between legal and illegal. You come down to the boat. And I think the legal civil disobedience, where they're willing to accept what the law designates as punishment for whatever they've transgressed, is an honorable way to get one's point across. But there are other ways as well, and when I was in the United States Senate, a group of student protesters at Harvard University were trying to demand divestment of apartheid stocks in South Africa by the university. And they came to me and asked if I would run as a candidate for the board against the official slate of candidates. And I said, well, who else have you got? And they said, well, Desmond Tutu. And I said, okay. And we joined the board and played a role with many, many others in getting Harvard to divest from apartheid stocks. So, I think fossil-free research, divestment from fossil fuel investments, it is really the right thing to do. Now, where this issue is concerned, it's deeply complex, and we can get into it if you want, but that will be another long conversation.
Yes, well, very sadly, we are now out of time. At Cambridge, we are obviously an educational institution that aims not just to educate students to know what sits inside books or laboratories, but also to try to go out and do good in the world, to change the world. And at the age of 76, I think you are a fantastic example of how a life can be well spent in trying to change the world. I think many people watching this here are a third of your age or less, so you have a lot of time ahead of you to try and take these lessons. But thank you very much indeed for coming to King's. We look forward enormously to the sermon tomorrow. And we're delighted that you are currently in the right Cambridge, the older Cambridge. And let's all have a big round of applause to say that.